Lucas had always been the quiet, withdrawn type. At 25, he still lived with his father, Greg, in a house on the outskirts of Portland, Oregon. The suburban neighborhood was picturesque rows of cookie cutter homes with manicured lawns, surrounded by trees that changed color with the seasons. There was a sense of calm here, but it was the kind of peace that only highlighted the emptiness that filled Lucas's life. His mother had passed away when he was 16, leaving a hole in his world that neither time nor his father could ever fill. Greg, his father, was a workaholic, often traveling for business, and when he was home, he spent more time buried in paperwork than speaking to his son. It was never that Greg didn't care, but his love was buried under layers of obligation and responsibility. At first, living alone with his father wasn't so bad. But when Greg remarried 5 years ago, things started to change. Helen came into their lives a striking woman in her late 40s with green eyes and dark chestnut hair. She was elegant and poised, and she brought a softness to the house that had been missing for years. Yet, for Lucas, her presence was both comforting and disorienting. She wasn't like his mother, and yet, in some ways, she reminded him of her kindness, her warmth, and the way she seemed to understand unspoken things. Yet, despite all her kindness, there was always an unspoken tension between them. Helen's smile was always warm, her eyes always understanding, but there were moments, fleeting, quiet moments, when Lucas caught her looking at him just a second too long. And when she would leave the room, his chest would tighten, his heart racing as if she had left something behind, something that lingered in the air. He hadn't acknowledged it at first. But as the years went by, the tension grew. He found himself noticing the curve of her neck when she would turn away, the way her hair cascaded down her back, or the way she would laugh at something he said, her lips curling ever so slightly. Introducing the family dynamic Lucas's life was one of quiet routine. He worked part-time at a local tech store, fixing phones and laptops for a meager wage. His job wasn't glamorous, but it was enough to keep him distracted. The majority of his days were spent alone in his room, either playing video games or scrolling through his phone. His life lacked meaning. There were no friends, no partners, no real social interactions. Helen, on the other hand, had her own life. She worked as a freelance photographer, often traveling for assignments, and when she was home, she would be busy with her camera, capturing the world with an intensity that Lucas couldn't quite understand. But even in her most absorbed moments, she never seemed out of reach. She was always present, but in recent months, there was something different about her. Something more distant. Greg, on the other hand, was almost always absent. Business trips, late night calls, and long hours at work kept him away from home for days or weeks at a time. When he was around, he was often tired or distracted. It wasn't that Greg didn't care, it was just that Lucas wasn't a priority for him. Greg's relationship with Helen had taken center stage, and Lucas was left to navigate his own emotions and thoughts in the silence of the house. And yet, there was a strange sort of comfort in that silence. It was predictable, safe, but it was also suffocating. Introducing Helen was not the type of woman Lucas could easily ignore. There was an elegance to her and effortless grace that seemed to draw people in. She wasn't just beautiful, she was captivating in a way that made everything about her seem purposeful. From the way she moved to the way she spoke, every detail about her seemed perfectly orchestrated. But it wasn't just her physical beauty that caught his attention, it was her energy. There was something undeniably magnetic about her. Her laughter filled the room, and her presence seemed to fill any space she entered. Lucas found himself drawn to her even though he couldn't fully understand why. He admired her from afar, often lost in his thoughts, wondering what it would be like to be close to her, close enough to feel the warmth of her presence. The more he watched her, the more he felt like an outsider in his own home. Helen and Greg seemed to have their own world, one where Lucas was only an observer. And though he didn't say it out loud, he couldn't shake the feeling that Helen treated him differently than she treated Greg. She had a softness in her gaze when she looked at him, a tenderness that didn't exist in her interactions with his father. The tension between them wasn't something either of them openly acknowledged, but Lucas could feel it every time they were in the same room. It was subtle, like an electric current running just beneath the surface. And it was starting to affect him more than he cared to admit. Suspenseful opening one evening, Greg was away on one of his business trips. It had become routine. Dinner with just him and Helen, silence and small talk. Lucas had become used to the pattern, but tonight something felt different. He couldn't place it, but the air felt thick. The house was quieter than usual, and Helen seemed distant, her mind elsewhere. After dinner, Lucas excused himself, retreating to his room. He closed the door behind him and let out a deep breath. But as he sat on his bed, scrolling through his phone, he heard the faint sound of footsteps outside his door. It wasn't unusual for Helen to check in on him from time to time. She always made sure he was okay when Greg was gone. But tonight, when the door creaked open, Lucas didn't immediately look up. He assumed it was just her, but then the sound of her soft voice made him freeze. He didn't know how long she had been standing there watching him. His heart raced and the strange sense of unease crawled up his spine. "Are you all right?" Helen's voice was calm, but there was something about it that sent a shiver down his back. The conversation lingered between them, unspoken words hanging in the air. Lucas looked up, meeting Helen's gaze. Her eyes seemed to soften, almost as if she had caught him at his most vulnerable. It was then that he realized how much he had been retreating into his own world, how much he had been avoiding her presence, despite how drawn to it he felt. "I'm fine," he muttered, almost embarrassed by how startled he was. Helen didn't seem convinced. She took a step closer to him, her presence filling the room. She didn't sit on the edge of his bed like she sometimes did. Instead, she stood there, her hand resting on the doorframe, a slight tension in her posture. She was still watching him, but there was something else in her gaze, something that made Lucas's chest tighten. For a moment, there was a strange silence. Lucas couldn't look away from her eyes, and he could see the way her expression shifted from concern to something else, something deeper, something more intimate. "You're not alone, Lucas," she said quietly, almost as if trying to reassure herself. "You don't have to shut yourself off." Lucas wasn't sure what to say. There were so many things he wanted to express, but the words were stuck in his throat. He wanted to tell her that he wasn't shutting himself off from her, that if anything, it was her who had become so distant. But he couldn't. Instead, he looked down at his hands, unsure of what he was feeling. Then, without warning, Helen stepped closer. She was so close now that he could smell the faint scent of her perfume. He felt her gaze on him, her warmth almost overwhelming. "There was no turning back now, Lucas," she whispered, her voice so soft it made his heart race, inciting incidents suddenly. Lucas's mind went blank. His body was on autopilot, reacting to the tension that had been building between them for months. He didn't know what came over him, but without thinking, he leaned forward. His lips met hers in a soft, hesitant kiss, a kiss that neither of them had expected, yet both of them had been silently longing for. It was brief, but it was enough to shatter the fragile boundary between them. Neither of them spoke afterward. Lucas's heart was pounding in his chest, his breath shallow. Helen was still standing there, motionless. Her eyes were wide, almost shocked. "What have we done?" she murmured, almost to herself, her voice trembling with the weight of the moment. The kiss had been brief, a fleeting moment in the heat of the moment, in the heat of the moment. But it was enough to alter everything between them. Neither Lucas nor Helen spoke for what seemed like an eternity. The air between them was thick with the weight of unspoken words, of actions that couldn't be undone. Helen pulled back first, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock, as if the kiss had woken her from a dream or a nightmare. She stepped away from him, as if the physical distance between them could somehow distance them emotionally. But Lucas could still feel the heat of her touch, the softness of her lips against his, lingering in his mind. His pulse raced, and every nerve in his body felt electrified. "Lucas," she finally whispered, her voice low and trembling. "What have we done?" Lucas opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He didn't know what to say. How could he explain the rush of feelings that had flooded him in that moment? It wasn't just physical attraction, it was something deeper, more complicated. Then something that, until that moment, he had tried to bury. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he managed to say, his voice shaky. He looked at the floor, unable to meet her gaze. His emotions were a chaotic storm inside him, and he was afraid if he spoke too much, he would lose control of them. Helen, on the other hand, seemed equally lost. Her mind was racing, and she couldn't fully comprehend what had just happened. But deep inside, she knew it wasn't just a mistake, it wasn't something she could brush off. The connection between them had always been there, subtle and unspoken, and now it had been exposed, raw and undeniable. "I don't know what to say," Helen murmured, her hand running through her hair in agitation. She paced back and forth for a few moments before stopping in front of him. "We can't do this, Lucas. This is wrong." "We're family?" Lucas flinched at the word, the gravity of her statement hitting him hard. Family. He knew it was wrong. He knew the consequences of crossing this line. But in the same breath, he couldn't deny the magnetic pull that had always existed between them, a pull he had tried to ignore, but one that had only grown stronger over time. "I didn't want this," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "But I can't help how I feel." There was silence again, but this time it was heavier, more suffocating. Neither of them knew what to say next. They both felt trapped, caught in a web of their own making. Helen retreated into herself, withdrawing to the kitchen to give herself some space. She tried to focus on the task at hand, cleaning up the dishes, pretending that she could forget what had just happened. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw Lucas's face, his eyes searching hers for some kind of understanding. She felt the weight of their kiss like a shadow that refused to lift. She'd always thought of Lucas as a son, the boy who had lost his mother too early, the boy who had become a man under the roof of their home. But now, with the kiss, something had shifted. Something inside her had woken up, and she couldn't pretend it didn't exist. It wasn't just an attraction, it was something deeper, something she hadn't even realized she was capable of feeling. Her mind swirled with questions. What did this mean for her marriage to Greg? What did it mean for her role in Lucas's life? And most hauntingly, what did it mean for her own identity? She had always seen herself as a wife, a mother, a woman who had her life together. But now she felt like she was losing in control, like she was slipping into a dangerous, unknown territory. She couldn't allow herself to think about it too much. She couldn't allow herself to want him, to feel this confusion, but the more she tried to push it away, the stronger the feelings became. Lucas spent the next few days in a state of turmoil. He couldn't stop thinking about the kiss. He felt guilty, ashamed, and confused all at once. He had always respected Helen, even admired her in a way. But now that line had been crossed, and it was impossible to go back. He avoided her, retreating to his room whenever she was around, unable to face her or himself. But the more he isolated himself, the more the feelings intensified. It was as if the silence between them only fueled his desire, and the guilt only deepened the emotional pull. At work, Lucas's mind wasn't on his task. He could barely concentrate on fixing phones or talking to customers. His thoughts kept drifting back to Helen, her smile, the way she moved, the way she had kissed him. He found himself replaying that moment over and over in his mind, each time more painful than the last. He knew what he had done was wrong, but a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't a mistake. It was as if they had been dancing around this moment for years, both of them too afraid to admit it. And now that it had happened, he didn't know how to move forward. He was trapped in a prison of his own emotions. One evening, after dinner, when Greg was once again away on a business trip, Lucas found himself alone in the house with Helen. The silence between them was unbearable. Lucas could feel the tension hanging in the air like a thick fog. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low. "I never meant to make things awkward." Helen, standing by the window, turned to face him. Her expression was a mixture of sadness and frustration and frustration. "Lucas," she said, her voice breaking, "you have to understand what we did. What happened, it changes everything." "It can't just be forgotten, I know," Lucas replied, his heart heavy. "I know it's wrong, but I can't pretend it didn't happen. I don't want to pretend it didn't happen." There was a long pause, and then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Helen spoke. "I don't know what to do with these feelings. I don't know how to stop wanting you." The words hit Lucas like a punch to the gut. Helen, the woman he had admired and respected, the woman who had been a second mother to him, was admitting to feelings she couldn't control. And in that moment, everything changed. Days turned into weeks, and the tension between Lucas and Helen only grew. They both tried to maintain the illusion of normalcy, but every glance, every accidental touch seemed to shatter that facade. It was as if their connection had grown too strong to ignore, and they were both on the brink of losing control. Helen spent more time away from the house, finding excuses to leave, but Lucas could feel the pull of their unspoken bond every time she returned. When she was home, he could hear her footsteps in the hallway, her presence in the kitchen. He could feel the weight of her gaze on him, even if she tried to hide it. One night, after a particularly tense dinner, Lucas found himself in the living room, staring at the fireplace. He was lost in thought, unable to escape the emotional chaos inside him. And then, without warning, Helen appeared in the doorway. Her eyes were red, and she looked as if she had been crying. "Lucas," she said softly, stepping into the room. "We need to talk." He didn't respond, but the ache in his chest grew. He knew what was coming, and he was terrified. "I can't keep doing this," Helen continued, her voice breaking. "I don't want to hurt Greg. I don't want to destroy this family. But I can't stop these feelings." Lucas turned to face her, his own heart heavy with the weight of their shared guilt. "I don't want to hurt anyone either," he said quietly. "But I can't keep pretending that nothing's happening between us." Helen took a step toward him, her eyes searching his face. "What do we do now?" she whispered. In that moment, Lucas knew there was no easy answer. There was no going back. Whatever they decided now would define the rest of their lives. The choice before them wasn't simple, it was a decision that would change everything. But he didn't know if he was ready to lose her or his family. The tension that had been building for weeks reached a breaking point. Lucas couldn't sleep. His mind was plagued by images of Helen, her words echoing in his mind. "I can't stop wanting you." He had tried to shut the thought out, tried to convince himself that it was just a fleeting moment of weakness. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. Helen, too, was spiraling. She couldn't escape the weight of the choices she had made, the dangerous path they had both started down. She spent long hours alone, pacing the house, trying to reason with herself, telling herself that they couldn't continue like this. But the pull was undeniable, a force that neither of them could fight. Greg's absence had created a void that neither of them could fill, but it also allowed the forbidden feelings to fester and grow. It was as if the house itself had become a prison, trapping them in a web of desires they couldn't escape. One evening, after an argument about an insignificant issue, Lucas and Helen found themselves alone in the living room once again. The air was thick with unspoken words, both of them waiting for the other to break the silence. Helen finally spoke, her voice shaky and low. "We need to talk about this. I can't keep pretending nothing's happening." Lucas's heart raced as he turned to face her. The look in her eyes was one of desperation, a deep longing that mirrored his own. "I don't know what we're doing anymore, Helen," he confessed. "I don't know what we're supposed to do. I don't want to destroy everything, but I can't deny how I feel." The words hung between them like a forbidden fruit, tantalizing yet dangerous. Helen's eyes filled with tears, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I don't want to destroy Greg, Lucas. I don't want to hurt anyone, but I can't stop myself. I don't know if I can live with this guilt anymore." The weight of her words crushed him. He stepped forward, reaching out to take her hand, a gesture of comfort, but also a silent acknowledgement that neither of them could turn back now. "We have to stop this, Helen," Lucas said softly, the pain in his voice evident. "We have to make a choice. I'm not sure I can live with the consequences of this anymore." Helen looked at him, her expression torn between guilt and longing. "I don't know if I can let you go, Lucas. I don't know if I can live without you now." The air between them crackled with the intensity of their emotions, and in that moment, everything became clear. They had reached a point of no return. Whatever decision they made now would shape the rest of their lives. The choice Helen stood in front of him, her face flushed, her eyes filled with tears. The distance between them seemed impossibly vast, but at the same time, she felt as though she was falling, her heart racing toward him despite every instinct that told her to run. "Lucas," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What if I can't let you go?" His heart clenched at her words. He wanted to reach out, to pull her into his arms, to promise that everything would be okay. But deep down, he knew that this wasn't a situation that could be solved by mere words or fleeting gestures. They had to confront the reality of their situation. "I don't know if I can live with the consequences either," Lucas said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I can't keep living like this. We can't keep pretending that nothing's happening between us." Helen's shoulders shook as she nodded, the tears flowing freely now. "Then we have to face it, Lucas. We have to face the truth." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and neither of them knew how to move forward. But at that moment, they both understood that they couldn't keep pretending anymore. Whatever the future held, they would have to face it together or apart. The departure days that followed were filled with a profound sense of loss. Lucas and Helen both struggled with the consequences of their choices. Helen withdrew into herself, spending more and more time alone, while Lucas found it harder to face her without the overwhelming urge to act on their emotions. One evening, Helen sat Lucas down. She had made a decision. "I'm leaving, Lucas," she said softly, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "I need to figure out who I am without all this confusion. I need to be alone to think." Lucas didn't speak at first. He had known this moment was coming, but hearing the words from her lips still struck him like a physical blow. He had hoped they could work through it together, but now he understood that she needed space to heal and to find herself again. "I understand," Lucas said quietly. I never wanted to hurt you, Helen. I never wanted any of this." Helen's face softened, and she reached out to touch his cheek gently. "I know, Lucas, I know, but sometimes love is messy. Sometimes it's too complicated. We both need time." It had been weeks since Helen had left. Lucas had tried to move on, to accept the consequences of their actions, but the void she left behind was unbearable. He had come to terms with the fact that they could never be together, that their relationship would always be tainted by the mistakes of the past. But even as he tried to rebuild his life, he couldn't shake the memory of her. The memory of their kiss, their shared desires haunted him. Meanwhile, Helen had spent the time away trying to find herself. She had gone on trips, met new people, and slowly began to understand what she truly wanted out of life. The feelings for Lucas were still there, buried deep within her, but she realized that she needed to let go, to let herself heal from the emotional whirlwind that had consumed her one afternoon. After months of silence, Helen reached out to Lucas. She had found peace in her own way and wanted to share it with him. "I've been thinking about everything," she said when they spoke on the phone. "About us, and I think I'm ready to move forward." Lucas's heart skipped a beat. He had missed her terribly, but he had come to accept that their relationship was over. Hearing her voice again stirred old feelings, but he knew he couldn't let them consume him. "I'm glad you're doing okay," he said, his voice steady. "I hope you found what you were looking for." Helen paused before responding. "I think I have. I've learned that sometimes we have to let go of things, even the things we love to heal. I don't want to keep hurting you, Lucas. I don't want to keep hurting myself for the first time in a long while." Lucas felt a sense of relief wash over him. He had been carrying the weight of their past for so long. And now, hearing Helen's words, he felt as though a burden had been lifted. A new beginning in the months that followed, both Lucas and Helen began new chapters in their lives. They still held on to the memories of what had happened between them, but they no longer let it define them. Their relationship, though complicated, had given them the chance to grow, to learn about themselves in ways they hadn't expected. Helen moved to a new city, started a new job, and began to rebuild her life. She had learned to forgive herself for the mistakes she had made, and she knew that she couldn't change the past. What mattered now was the future, the life she was building for herself. Lucas, too, began to heal. He threw himself into his work, focusing on his career and his personal growth. He started dating again, cautiously at first, but with an open heart. The guilt that had plagued him for so long began to fade, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. Though they were no longer a part of each other's lives in the way they once had been, Lucas and Helen knew that their journey had changed them. They had both learned valuable lessons about love, guilt, and self forgiveness. And while they would never forget what had passed between them, they had come to accept that some love stories, no matter how intense, were not meant to last forever.